She thought heartbreak would be the end of her story. Nights spent staring at the ceiling, mornings where even breathing felt heavy, love turning into nothing but a wound that refused to close. But then, a soft knock on the door next to hers, a smile from the girl living just across the hallway, and suddenly the silence inside her chest began to break. What started as small conversations, simple kindness, grew into something she never expected, something that showed her a new side of herself she had been too afraid to see. The days after he broke your heart felt endless, like time had stretched itself just to make you feel the weight of loneliness pressing down harder with every breath. You moved through them quietly, dragging yourself from bed not because you wanted to, but because the world demanded it. Work, chores, small conversations with people you hardly heard, everything became mechanical. It was like someone had taken the color out of your life and left only the gray. Nights were worse. Nights were cruel. You'd lie awake staring at the ceiling, going over every word, every promise, every moment you thought meant forever but instead turned into nothing. You replayed the last fight in your mind again and again, how his voice had been so firm, so final, and how your own had broken when you begged him not to leave. And when he walked away, it felt like the part of you that still believed in love left with him. You told yourself you'd never let anyone close again. You swore you'd build walls so high no one could ever climb them. But life has its quiet, stubborn ways of showing you what your heart really needs. It was a late evening when you first noticed her, your neighbor, standing just a few steps away in the shared hallway of your apartment building. You'd seen her before in passing, but this time was different. She was holding a mug of tea in one hand, hair tied up in a loose bun, wearing an oversized sweater that made her look effortlessly comfortable. She smiled when your eyes met, not the polite kind of smile people throw at strangers, but the gentle sort that lingers long enough to make you feel noticed. For the first time in weeks, your chest didn't feel so heavy. You nodded awkwardly, trying to hide the fact that you were still carrying heartbreak in your expression, but she seemed to sense it anyway. "Rough day?" she asked softly, her voice calm, warm, like the sound of rain tapping against a window. You hesitated, wanting to shrug it off, to retreat into the shell you had built, but something about her tone disarmed you. "Yeah," you admitted, your voice barely above a whisper. That was all you gave her, but it was enough. She didn't pry, didn't force a conversation out of you. Instead, she offered a small laugh, lifted her mug slightly, and said, "Tea helps. Want me to bring you one sometime?" You didn't know what to say. No one had spoken to you like that since everything fell apart, casual but kind, light but genuine. You found yourself nodding before your mind could catch up. That was the beginning. It wasn't a grand gesture, not a dramatic rescue, but a seed planted in the middle of your grief. The next evening, she knocked softly on your door. When you opened it, she was holding a second mug, steam curling up into the cool air between you. "Chamomile," she said with a grin. "It fixes everything. Or at least it pretends to." You laughed, the sound startling you, because it had been so long since laughter felt natural. You took the mug from her, your fingers brushing hers just for a second, and for a moment the gray inside you shifted, giving way to something gentler. You ended up talking by the doorway, leaning against the frame while she leaned casually against the wall. The conversation wasn't deep. She asked about your work, you asked about hers, she told you how she always burned toast no matter how hard she tried, and you admitted you hadn't cooked anything more complicated than instant noodles in weeks. But it wasn't the words that mattered. It was the comfort. It was the feeling of being seen again, not as someone broken or abandoned, but as someone still here, still human. That night, when you went to bed, your thoughts weren't only filled with him and the pain he caused. They were filled with her smile, her laugh, and the way her presence seemed to slip past the walls you thought you'd built so high. It scared you a little, how easily she did that. But it also gave you a strange sense of relief, like maybe the story of your heart hadn't ended after all. Maybe it was only beginning to be rewritten. And for the first time in so long, you closed your eyes and slept without the ache pressing so hard against your chest. The next days carried a different rhythm, subtle but undeniable, as if life itself had decided to breathe a little softer around you. You still woke up with traces of ache in your chest, but now there was a quiet thought lingering at the edge of your mind, a thought wrapped in the shape of her smile. It surprised you how much you looked forward to those small encounters in the hallway, how much you noticed the sound of her footsteps outside your door, the faint hum of music that sometimes drifted from her apartment. It wasn't dramatic or overwhelming, it was simply there, threading itself into the corners of your days without asking permission. One evening, you found yourself lingering by your window longer than usual, staring at the dim glow of her lamp shining through the blinds of the apartment next door. It was strange how comforting it felt to know she was so close, almost like her presence existed as a small reassurance that you weren't entirely alone. The world outside still moved the same way. It was busy, loud, filled with people going about their lives, but your focus had shifted, your heart paying attention to the gentle details it had ignored for too long. A knock came at your door just as you were setting down a plate of untouched food. It startled you at first, but when you opened it and saw her standing there with that easy grin, your chest softened in recognition. She was holding a plate covered in foil, the faint aroma of something warm drifting toward you. "I made way too much pasta," she said, shrugging as if it wasn't a big deal. "Figured you could help me out." You blinked, taken aback, not by the food but by the thought. It had been so long since anyone had gone out of their way to include you in something so simple, and the tenderness of the gesture pressed at the rawest parts of you. "You really didn't have to," you murmured, but she only waved her hand and nudged the plate toward you. "I know," she replied, her tone soft, "but I wanted to." That small choice of words lingered with you more than you expected. You invited her in, hesitantly at first, but the moment she stepped across the threshold, it was as if the air in your apartment shifted. Her presence carried warmth, filling spaces that had felt empty for weeks. You sat together at the table, sharing bites of pasta and small talk, but the comfort in the silence between words spoke louder than anything else. You watched the way she spoke with her hands, the way her laughter came easily and unforced, the way she looked at you without a hint of pity, only a softness that made you feel seen. As the conversation stretched, you noticed yourself opening up in ways you hadn't planned. You told her how you had lost interest in cooking, how most nights you lived off takeout or instant meals because real food just reminded you of him, the one who used to stand beside you in the kitchen as if love was something that could be stirred into a pot. She listened without judgment, her gaze steady, her presence calm. "I get that," she said quietly, after a pause. "When I went through my own breakup, even making coffee felt too heavy for a while. It's like the smallest things remind you of what you've lost." You tilted your head, surprised by her honesty, by the way she offered a piece of herself so freely. Something shifted in you then, a quiet realization that she understood more than you had imagined. She wasn't just kind because she didn't know pain, she was kind because she had lived through it, too. Later that night, after she left, you sat in the quiet of your apartment and felt something stirring inside you. It wasn't love yet, not in the way stories rush to paint it. It was something gentler, a flicker of connection, a warmth that made the loneliness feel less suffocating. You found yourself smiling as you rinsed the dishes, not because the ache of your heartbreak had disappeared, but because for the first time in a long time, it wasn't the only thing you felt. You thought about how she had looked at you when you left, how her eyes had softened in that unspoken way that said she was glad to see you lighten. And that night, when you went to bed, your mind didn't replay the harsh endings of what had been lost. Instead, it lingered on the unexpected beginning unfolding just across the hall. It frightened you a little, to feel your heart stir again, but it also carried hope. And somewhere deep down, you began to understand that maybe healing wasn't about forgetting who broke you. Maybe it was about finding someone who helped you remember who you could still become. The nights began to change after that, not because your pain had vanished but because there was now something else to carry alongside it. The weight of heartbreak still lingered in your chest, but it no longer sat there alone. Each evening seemed to pull you and her closer, as though an invisible thread had been quietly woven between your doors. You found yourself expecting her knock, listening for the shuffle of her slippers in the hallway, waiting for the casual way she would appear with a smile that softened the roughest edges of your day. And when she didn't knock, you would catch yourself glancing at the clock, wondering if you should be the one to break the silence. It happened one evening when the city outside was muted by a steady drizzle, the kind of rain that made everything feel quieter, heavier, and strangely more intimate. She knocked softly, and when you opened the door, her hair was damp, tiny drops clinging to her sweater. She gave a half-smile and held up a bag of cookies. "Emergency sugar run," she said, laughing lightly. You let her in, and this time it felt less like a guest stepping into your space and more like someone belonging there. You sat cross-legged on the floor of your living room, sharing cookies and tea while the rain tapped against the windows, and the conversation drifted somewhere deeper than it ever had before. She asked about your childhood, not in a way that felt prying but in a way that made you remember moments you hadn't thought about in years. You told her about summers spent riding bikes until the streetlights came on, about the way you once believed love would be simple and permanent. She listened with her chin resting on her hand, her eyes fixed on you as if every word mattered. Then she told you her own stories, of her first heartbreak in college, of a girl who loved her in private but never dared to hold her hand in public. The pain in her voice was quiet but real, the kind of pain you recognized, and it made you realize she carried scars too. You had thought of her as unshakable, someone who radiated calm because she had never been burned, but that night she showed you otherwise. And strangely, it didn't make her weaker in your eyes. It made her human. It made her even more magnetic. The hours slipped by unnoticed. You found yourself leaning closer as you spoke, drawn to the warmth of her laughter and the softness in her voice when she grew serious. At one point, she brushed a crumb from the corner of your lip without even thinking, and the casualness of the gesture set your heart racing. You looked at her then, really looked, and something in her eyes reflected back at you, something unspoken, something waiting. It scared you because it felt too soon, too raw, but it also comforted you because it felt so real. When the clock struck midnight and the rain still poured outside, she stood reluctantly, as though she too didn't want the night to end. At the door, she lingered, her hand resting lightly against the frame as she turned back to you. "I like this," she admitted softly. "Just being here with you." The words caught you off guard, leaving your heart stumbling over itself. You nodded, unable to find the right reply, and instead whispered, "Me too." After she left, the silence of your apartment didn't feel like silence anymore. It felt full, filled with the echo of her laughter, the warmth of her presence, and the possibility of something growing between you that you hadn't dared to hope for again. That night in bed, you stared at the ceiling, your mind replaying the way she had looked at you, the honesty in her eyes, the ease with which your souls seemed to have recognized each other. You realized you had begun to trust her, to let her into places inside you that had been shut tight for too long. It wasn't love yet, not in the overwhelming sense you once believed love had to be, but it was something just as powerful. It was trust. It was connection. It was a small, steady flame flickering to life in the ruins of what you had lost. And as you drifted to sleep, you understood with a quiet certainty that this was only the beginning, that something was shifting in you, reshaping the way you saw yourself, the way you felt about love, and the way you looked at the girl living just across the hall. The days that followed should have been easier, but instead they pulled at you in complicated ways. The closeness you had begun to feel with her was warm, gentle, and grounding, yet it also frightened you. You found yourself thinking of her more often than you admitted, when you made coffee in the morning, when you passed her door in the hallway, when your phone buzzed late at night and you hoped it was her. Every smile she gave you seemed to melt another piece of the walls you had so carefully built, and it scared you to realize how quickly she had slipped past your defenses. You had promised yourself after the breakup that you wouldn't let anyone hold your heart again, not for a long time, not until the cracks inside you had healed. But here she was, undoing that vow without even trying. And the truth was, it wasn't her fault. It was you, your heart betraying you by wanting more when your mind begged for distance. One evening, when she came over carrying a blanket and insisted you both watch a movie together, you felt the weight of it more strongly than ever. She curled into the couch beside you, her shoulder brushing yours, her laughter spilling into the quiet of your apartment as if she belonged there. You tried to focus on the screen, but your eyes kept drifting to her profile, the way the light softened the edges of her face, the way her lips curved when she smiled. A sharp pang ran through you because you knew how dangerous this was. You had fallen before. You had trusted before. And look where it had left you, heart shattered, convinced you weren't enough. When the movie ended and she leaned into you without hesitation, you froze. Her head rested against your shoulder, her breath warm and steady, and for a moment, you almost let yourself sink into it. But then the memories of betrayal crashed back, and panic clawed at you. What if this ended the same way? What if you were only setting yourself up to break all over again? The fear was louder than the comfort. You shifted slightly, enough that she lifted her head and glanced at you, her brows furrowing just a little. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice soft but full of concern. You forced a smile, the kind that didn't reach your eyes, and nodded. "Yeah, just tired," you lied, standing too quickly and busying yourself with picking up the empty mugs on the table. She didn't press you, didn't call out the lie you knew she must have sensed. Instead, she gave a small nod and began folding the blanket, her movements slower, quieter than before. The air between you felt different now, still warm, but tinged with something unspoken. After she left that night, you sat alone on the couch, staring at the door, guilt gnawing at you. You hated that your fear had created distance, that your hesitation might have hurt her. But you couldn't help it. The thought of opening your heart completely again terrified you in ways you couldn't put into words. For days after, you avoided her more than usual. You let texts sit unanswered longer, you declined her casual invitations with excuses about work or errands, you tried to convince yourself that keeping space was safer. But the more you pulled away, the emptier you felt. The silence in your apartment grew heavier again, and the loneliness you had thought she had chased away returned like an unwelcome shadow. You missed her. You missed her laughter echoing against your walls, the way her presence softened the sharp edges of your pain, the way she looked at you like you weren't broken. The truth settled deep in your chest, she hadn't asked you for anything more than your company. She hadn't demanded love or commitment. All she had done was offer you kindness, and you had turned it into something to fear. One night, as you sat alone with your thoughts pressing hard against you, you realized you had a choice. You could keep hiding, let the fear win, and lose something that was quietly becoming the most beautiful part of your days. Or you could risk it, risk the vulnerability, risk the ache, because maybe this time was different. Maybe she was different. And maybe the love you had once lost wasn't meant to be the final chapter of your story after all. The silence between you stretched for days, and though you tried to convince yourself it was better this way, the truth gnawed at you every time you walked past her door or heard the faint sound of her laughter drifting through the wall. You had thought pulling back would protect you, would give you the distance you needed to stay safe, but instead it only hollowed you out. Every excuse you made felt weaker than the last, every unanswered message left you restless, and you began to realize that in trying to shield your heart, you were only starving it. The night you finally broke the silence was not planned. You had spent the entire day distracted, unable to focus on anything, your mind circling back to her again and again. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in muted shades of orange and purple, you couldn't stand it anymore. You paced the length of your apartment, telling yourself to leave it alone, to let things fade quietly, but your heart throbbed against your ribs like it was begging to be heard. Before you knew it, you were standing in the hallway, staring at her door. For a long moment, you couldn't move, your hand hovering just inches away from knocking. Then, gathering every shred of courage you had left, you tapped gently. When the door opened, she looked surprised, her brows lifting slightly as her eyes searched your face. She didn't speak right away, and the silence made you stumble over your words. I'm sorry, you blurted out, your voice uneven. For disappearing. For pulling away. I didn't know how to handle it. She tilted her head, still quiet, waiting for you to continue, and that patience, her quiet willingness to give you space even now, nearly undid you. You stepped inside when she gestured for you to come, your chest tightening as you sat down on the edge of her couch, your hands clasped tightly together. After everything that happened with him, you admitted, the words tumbling out faster than you expected, I promised myself I wouldn't let anyone get close again. I told myself I couldn't survive another heartbreak. And then you showed up, and it scared me how easy it felt, how natural. I panicked. I didn't mean to hurt you, I didn't trust myself. For a long moment, she said nothing. You couldn't bring yourself to look at her, afraid of what you might see, but then her hand rested gently over yours, grounding you in its quiet warmth. I knew something was wrong, she said softly. I could see it in your eyes. And I didn't want to push, because I know what it's like to be afraid of letting someone in. Your throat tightened, emotion rushing through you like a tide. You finally looked up and met her gaze, and what you found there wasn't disappointment or frustration, it was understanding. Deep, patient understanding that made your chest ache. I don't want to run anymore, you whispered. Not from you. She smiled then, small but steady, and squeezed your hand gently. Then don't. I'm not asking for forever. I'm not asking you to forget the past overnight. I just want to be here, with you, in whatever way you're ready for. The simplicity of her words broke something open inside you. All the fear, all the doubt, all the walls you had built crumbled in the face of her kindness. You leaned forward before you could stop yourself, your forehead resting against hers, your breath shaky as relief and longing tangled together. Neither of you moved for a long while, the silence filled only with the closeness of being understood. When her hand slid up to rest gently against your cheek, you let out a breath you hadn't realized you'd been holding, and for the first time in months, you felt safe enough to just exist in the moment. The kiss, when it finally came, was soft and tentative, like a question asked in the quiet between heartbeats. It wasn't rushed or desperate, it was steady, patient, and achingly tender. And as your lips brushed against hers, you realized this wasn't about replacing the love you had lost. It was about finding a new way to be whole. That night, you stayed longer than you meant to, curled up together on her couch, speaking in low voices about the things you feared and the things you hoped. You told her pieces of your story you had never shared aloud, and she listened without judgment, her thumb brushing slow circles against your hand. And when the night grew late and you finally stood to leave, she walked you to the door and whispered, "You don't have to be afraid with me." You carried those words back into your apartment like a promise, and for the first time in so long, the future didn't feel like something to dread. It felt like something you could step into, hand in hand with her, one fragile but hopeful step at a time. The morning after that night together felt different. The light streaming through your window seemed softer, the air less heavy, as though the world itself had shifted slightly. For the first time in months, you woke up not with a sense of dread but with a flicker of excitement humming beneath your skin. The memory of her lips against yours, the warmth of her hand in yours, the steady comfort of her voice still lingered. It was fragile, like something too new to name, but it was real. You found yourself smiling without meaning to, and for a brief moment, you allowed yourself to believe that maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something you could finally trust. But the world has a way of testing the things we try hardest to protect. It began with whispers, small and sharp, carried through the walls of the building and the sideways glances of neighbors who had noticed the two of you spending more time together. You told yourself it didn't matter, that their opinions were meaningless, but the weight of their stares still pressed against you when you passed them in the hall. It wasn't just them. Your phone rang one evening with your sister's voice on the other end, sharp with suspicion. She had always been quick to notice shifts in your life, and this time was no different. "You've been different lately," she said. "Happier, maybe. Is there someone new?" The question caught in your throat, and though part of you wanted to tell her the truth, fear won out. "Just a friend," you replied, the lie tasting bitter even as you said it. She didn't press, but the hesitation in your voice hung in the air long after the call ended. The conflict grew louder inside you with every passing day. With her, you felt lighter, safer, like you could breathe again. But outside that bubble, the doubts whispered relentlessly. What if people judged you? What if your family turned away from you? What if you were only setting yourself up for another heartbreak? At night, the questions piled up until they kept you awake, staring at the ceiling in the same way you had when he left you, but this time the ache wasn't just from loss, it was from the fear of losing something before it had even fully bloomed. She noticed, of course. She always noticed. One evening when you came over, she looked at you with that quiet seriousness that meant she had seen through all your practiced smiles. "You've been distant again," she said gently, not accusing, just observing. You wanted to deny it, to insist everything was fine, but the truth spilled out of you before you could stop it. You told her about the neighbors, about the phone call with your sister, about the fears that knotted themselves so tightly in your chest you could barely breathe. Your voice broke halfway through, shame flooding you as the words tumbled out. You expected her to be disappointed, maybe even frustrated, but instead she reached for your hand and held it firmly. "Let them talk," she said, her tone steady and certain. "They don't get to decide who you love or how you heal. That's yours. Only yours." The conviction in her voice stunned you. She wasn't afraid in the way you were. She wasn't hiding, shrinking back into herself to avoid judgment. She stood there, unwavering, and for a moment you wondered how she had grown so strong. You told her as much, and she smiled, shaking her head. "I'm not stronger," she said. "I've just learned that people will always have something to say. But if you live your life for them, you'll never really live at all." Her words settled deep in you, pressing against the fear like sunlight against shadow. You didn't know how to silence the doubts completely, not yet, but in that moment you realized you didn't have to face them alone. She wasn't asking you to be fearless. She was only asking you to trust her enough to take one step forward at a time. That night, as you walked back to your apartment, the whispers in the hallway still followed you, but they didn't feel as sharp. You carried her words with you, her certainty, her handprint still warm against yours. And for the first time, the fear didn't drown out the hope. Instead, they coexisted, messy, complicated, and real. And as much as it scared you, it also made you believe that this was what love truly looked like, not the perfection you once thought it should be, but the courage to stay even when the world tried to push you apart. The days that followed were not free of doubt, but something inside you had shifted. You still heard the whispers, still felt the weight of curious eyes, still wrestled with the quiet disapproval you sensed from certain people around you. But instead of letting those things swallow you whole, you began to lean into her presence more deeply. She became your anchor in ways you hadn't expected, not by erasing your fears but by reminding you, again and again, that you were more than them. Every evening you spent together felt like a small rebellion, a quiet declaration that you were choosing each other despite the noise of the world. You started to notice the little things she did that made you feel safe, the way she never rushed you to talk but always left space for your silence, the way she carried extra tea bags in her purse just so she could make you a cup when you looked tired, the way her hand would find yours naturally when you walked side by side, not caring if anyone was watching. These gestures built a rhythm between you, one that was steady, reassuring, and unlike anything you had experienced before. With him, love had been a performance, something you always felt you had to prove or protect. With her, it felt like breathing, unforced, natural, and honest. There was a night when you found yourselves on her balcony, The city stretched out below like a blanket of flickering lights. You leaned against the railing, the cool night air brushing against your skin, while she stood close enough that your shoulders touched. She pointed out constellations, laughing when you squinted and admitted you could barely see them. "That one," she said, tracing an invisible line in the sky, "is supposed to be Orion. I used to make wishes on it when I was a kid." You turned to her, curious. "Did they ever come true?" She smiled, soft and reflective, her eyes catching the glow of the city. "Not always," she admitted. "But I guess the point wasn't about them coming true. It was about believing they could." Her words lingered with you, stirring something in your chest. You realized that was what she was teaching you, to believe again, not in perfection, not in guarantees, but in the possibility of love even after heartbreak. Later that night, as you sat side by side wrapped in the same blanket, you told her things you had never voiced before. You spoke about the pieces of yourself you had lost when he walked away, about the way you had convinced yourself you weren't worth loving anymore, about the nights when the silence in your apartment felt suffocating. She listened without interrupting, her gaze steady, her hand tightening around yours. And when you finished, her response was simple but powerful. "You're worth everything," she whispered. "Every laugh, every late-night conversation, every quiet morning. Don't ever believe otherwise." The truth of her words broke you open in a way that felt both painful and healing. Tears slipped down your cheeks before you could stop them, but she didn't flinch. She brushed them away gently, her thumb lingering against your skin, and then she kissed you, not in a way that tried to erase the pain, but in a way that acknowledged it, honored it, and reminded you that you didn't have to carry it alone. From that night on, something inside you grew stronger. The doubts didn't disappear, but they lost their power. You began to imagine a future that included her, not in fleeting moments or secret wishes, but in real, tangible ways. You pictured mornings with her making coffee while you teased her for burning the toast again. You pictured evenings spent curled up on the couch, laughter spilling into the quiet. You pictured walking down the street with her hand in yours, not caring who saw, because what you had was too real to hide. These weren't fantasies, they were possibilities, fragile but alive. And with every step forward, you felt more certain that this love, born out of heartbreak and fear, was slowly becoming the strongest part of you. You no longer thought of her as just the girl next door. She had become your safe place, your reminder that even in the aftermath of loss, love could still grow in the unlikeliest of spaces. And as you drifted to sleep each night with her face lingering in your thoughts, you realized that the new side of yourself she had shown you wasn't just about loving again. It was about finally learning how to love without losing yourself. The weeks that followed unfolded like a story you never thought you would be brave enough to live. Life didn't suddenly become perfect, but there was a steadiness between you now, a quiet certainty that grew stronger with each day. Where there had once been fear, there was now something else, something warmer, steadier, and far more powerful than the doubt that had weighed you down. You found yourself no longer bracing for heartbreak every time she knocked on your door or reached for your hand. Instead, you began to lean into the rhythm you had both created, allowing yourself to believe in the small moments of happiness that kept building, one after another, into something that felt lasting. One Saturday morning, sunlight poured across your apartment floor, spilling golden light over the couch where the two of you sat together, your legs tangled beneath a blanket. She had fallen asleep with her head resting on your shoulder, her breathing slow and peaceful, and you simply sat there watching her, realizing that for the first time in so long, you weren't afraid of what tomorrow might bring. You thought about how far you had come, from the nights of crying yourself to sleep, to the walls you built around your heart, to the way she had gently, patiently broken through every barrier without demanding anything in return. You thought about how she had seen you not as someone broken but as someone worth knowing, worth loving, worth choosing. And in that quiet morning, you allowed yourself to believe it too. Later that day, as you both walked through the neighborhood, hand in hand, you noticed the stairs again. The same neighbors who once whispered behind half-closed doors still looked at you with curiosity, some with disapproval. But this time, you didn't shrink under their gaze. You tightened your grip on her hand, and when you looked at her, she gave you a smile so steady it erased the rest of the world. In that moment, you realized the whispers no longer had power over you. They were background noise to a love that had already proven itself stronger. That evening, you cooked together for the first time in what felt like forever. It wasn't anything complicated, just pasta and vegetables, but it felt significant. You remembered how you used to avoid the kitchen because it reminded you too much of him, how cooking had become a wound you didn't want to touch. But with her standing beside you, teasing you when you cut the vegetables unevenly, laughing when the pasta water nearly boiled over, the kitchen no longer felt haunted. It felt alive again. It felt like yours. When you finally sat down to eat, she raised her glass of water with a grin. "To survival," she said. You laughed, clinking your glass against hers. "To starting over," you replied. But in your heart, it was more than that. It was to love, the kind that heals, the kind that doesn't demand perfection, the kind that makes you feel whole again. Later that night, as you lay together in the dark, her arm draped over you, her breath warm against your neck, you whispered the words you had been holding back for weeks. "I love you." For a heartbeat, silence filled the room, and your chest tightened with nerves. But then she shifted, pressing a kiss to your shoulder, her voice steady and sure as she whispered back, "I love you too." It wasn't a dramatic declaration. It wasn't shouted into the world. It was quiet, intimate, and real, exactly the way love should be. And it was enough. As you drifted to sleep in her arms, you thought about how heartbreak had once convinced you that love was over for you, that the best you could hope for was to survive the emptiness. But here you were, not only surviving, but living. Loving. Becoming. The girl next door had shown you a side of yourself you didn't know existed, the side that could still trust, still hope, still open up despite the scars. And as the night wrapped itself around you both, you knew this was only the beginning. Whatever came next, you would face it together, hand in hand, heart to heart. Because love, you realized, wasn't about avoiding pain. It was about finding the person who made the risk worth it. And with her, you finally understood that you had found exactly that.